in the studio now. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Oh, thanks.
What do you think is the key to understand about Iran right now, about the U.S., well, about your title, Target Iran?
Well, the most important thing is to understand the reality that Iran is squarely in the crosshairs as a target of the Bush administration, in particular as a target of the Bush administration as it relates to the national security strategy of the United States. You see, this isn't a hypothetical debate among political analysts, foreign policy specialists. Read the 2006 version of the national security strategy, where Iran is named 16 times as the #1 threat to the national security of the United States of America. Because in this same document, it embraces the notion of preemptive wars of aggression as a legitimate means of dealing with such threats. It also recertifies the Bush administration doctrine of regional transformation globally, but in this case particularly in the Middle East. So we're not talking about hypotheticals here, regardless of all the discussion that the Bush administration would like you to believe there is about diplomacy. There is no diplomacy, as was the case with Iraq. Diplomacy is but a smokescreen to disguise the ultimate objective of regime change.
Can you talk about the difference in approach the U.S. takes to North Korea, which has, according to their own reports, set off a nuclear bomb, and Iran?
Well, the only thing that the Bush administration's approach towards North Korea and the Bush administration's approach towards Iran have in common is that the end game is regime change. Other than that, what you see, I guess the other thing they have in common is the total incoherence of their approach. Look, North Korea and Iran, you can't compare. It's apples and oranges. North Korea is a declared nuclear power. They've declared their intent to have nuclear weapons. They haven't hidden this from anybody. They withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty in total conformity with the rule of law. They put the world on notice. They said, we will not participate. They gave them the appropriate timeline. They invited the inspectors out. And then, surprise, surprise, despite the fact that the Bush administration said, well, they're just bluffing. Well, they're not bluffing. They just popped one off. And guess what? If we continue to push North Korea irresponsibly, because again, what are we talking about here? What do we want to achieve in North Korea? Do we really care about the North Korean people? Want human rights to? No, regime change. This is all about regime change. This is about the United States being able to dictate the terms of coexistence with everybody else in the world. Do people understand that our policy towards China is regime change? Do they understand what the ramifications of that is? That's what's going on with North Korea. And we shouldn't be surprised that they did exactly what they said they were going to do. Now, we take Iran. Iran is a nation that says, we don't have a nuclear weapons program. We have no intention. In fact, when North Korea exploded their device, the Iranians condemned it. They said nuclear weapons cannot be part of the global equation. And yet, we continue to try and lump them together as if North Korea and Iran are part and parcel of the same policy. Well, maybe they are part and parcel of the same incoherent approach that the Bush administration has taken to dealing with nuclear proliferation.
Scott Ritter, you just returned from Iran?
I was in Iran in early September, yes.
And what did you do there?
I went there as a journalist for Nation magazine. I was there to research an article that hopefully will come out sometime in November. You know, it was funny, the Iranian government, like many governments, says one thing, does another. I had a whole agenda that had been agreed upon in advance, that I was going to go and interview X, interview Y, visit Site C, etc. And I got there to find out that the Iranian government, regardless of what we had coordinated here in the United States, had no clue, A, that I was coming, and B, that I had an agenda. So I show up in Iran, and I'm on my own. What an eye-opening experience to be on your own in a nation that has been called an Islamic fascist state. I've been to dictatorships in the Middle East. I've been to nations that have a high security profile. Iran is not one of these nations. I'm a former intelligence officer who has, stated some pretty strong positions on Iran, and yet I had full freedom of movement in Iran with no interference whatsoever. And as a result, although I didn't have the approved agenda, I had my own agenda, which allowed me to interview senior government officials, senior military officials, senior intelligence officials, and to visit sites that were deemed sensitive. The conclusion is that the American media has gotten it wrong on Iran. It's a very modern, westernized, pro-Western, and surprisingly pro-American country that does not constitute a threat to the United States whatsoever.
You're a former weapons inspector in Iraq.
Correct.
Can you talk about similarities or differences you see between the lead up to the invasion of Iraq and what's happening now with Iran?
The biggest similarity that we need to point out is that in both cases, no evidence was put forward to sustain the allegations that are being made. Iraq was accused of having weapons of mass destruction programs, reconstituting chemical, biological, nuclear, and long-range ballistic missile programs. There was an inspection process in place that had access, full access to the facilities in question, and no data was derived from these inspections that backed up the Bush administration's allegations. And yet, Iraq was told it's not up to the inspectors to find the weapons. It's up to Iraq to prove they don't exist. Iraq had to prove a negative. And it couldn't. We now know that in 1991, Saddam Hussein had destroyed the totality of his weapons programs. There weren't any left to find, discover. There was no threat. We now have Iran. It's alleged to have a nuclear weapons program. And yet the International Atomic Energy Agency, the inspectors who have had full access to the sites in Iran, have come out and said, while we can't say that there isn't a secret program that we don't know about, what we can say, as a direct result of our investigations, there is no data whatsoever to sustain the Bush administration's claims that there is a nuclear weapons program. And yet, the Bush administration once again is putting the onus on Iran, saying it's not up to the inspectors to find a nuclear weapons program. It's up to the Iranians to prove that one doesn't exist. Why do we go down this path? Because you can't prove a negative. There's nothing Iran can do that will satisfy the Bush administration, because the policy at the end of the day is not about nonproliferation. It's not about disarmament. It's about regime change. And all the Bush administration wants to do is to create the conditions that support their ultimate objective of military intervention.
Scott Ritter, one of the things you talk about in your book is that no attention has been paid to the Supreme Leader's pronouncement in the form of a fatwa that Iran rejects outright the acquisition of nuclear weapons.
But when we say Supreme Leader, first of all, most Americans are going to scratch their head and say, who? Because you see, we have a poster boy for demonization out there. His name is Ahmadinejad. He's the idiot that comes out and says really stupid, vile things, such as it is the goal of Iran to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And he makes ridiculous statements about the United States and et cetera. And of course, man, it's a field day for the American media, for the Western media, because you get all the little sound bites out there. Ahmadinejad, president of Iran. But what people don't understand is while he can vocalize all this, his finger is not on any button of power. If you read the Iranian constitution, you'll see that the president of Iran is almost a figurehead. The true power in Iran rests with the supreme leader. The supreme leader is the Ayatollah Khamenei. He is supported